Hey, what's going on, guys? Ben Brewster here with Tread Athletics. Today we're going to film episode 4 of our Q&A podcast. Filming here from our new facility in Charlotte, North Carolina. So going to give you guys a tour in the next month or so as soon as we kind of get everything set up. But super excited to be hiring again, to be in a new facility, and to keep on growing Tread. So just giving you a heads up as far as where we're at on that end. With that being said, we got about 25 to 30 questions. I'm going to try to get through these fairly quickly today, just so that I can get to as many of these questions that you guys submitted as possible and get a quick turnaround on this video, as opposed to dividing it up into multiple podcasts. So with that being said, let's dive right in. This is something I've struggled with a little bit myself. I think it's really important, if you can, if it's at all possible, to find someone who knows your body, who knows your goals, who's qualified to be able to give their input and control some of the variables in your program. Myself, personally, I have programmed for myself much of my own career. Part of the problem, part of the drawback with that is that although you do know yourself very, very well and you're in tune with your mechanical feels and things like that, you tend to have a tendency to focus on the things that you're already good at. And it's really tough to kind of put yourself in an outsider's shoes and take an objective look at what your strengths and weaknesses are. Even if you have the intention of that, you don't necessarily actually go and act on that as much as you necessarily would. So, me personally, I love heavy strength training. I love getting after it, but it took a number of years to be able to kind of put myself in a different position and realize, like, look, even though I enjoy this, it's not really my weakness. It's not what I need to be focusing on. At a certain point, it becomes much more about movement, becomes much more about injury prevention, much more about subtle mechanical feels, things like that. So if you have a glaring weakness, sometimes you doing your own programming isn't always the best solution. Not to mention the fact that, what I know now is significantly more than what I knew a year ago, significantly more than what I knew 5 years ago. So if you can find somebody who's a mentor, who's a coach, who's been through it for the past 5, 10, 15 years, they're going to have a much different perspective, a much broader array of experiences to draw from when programming than you might necessarily have, even though you know your body better. So definitely good to have somebody write your programming. I know lots of strength coaches, lots of people in the industry who do have a high level of expertise still have somebody else write their programming, just so that they can kind of take themselves out of it and put themselves in training mode when they need to train, and kind of have an unbiased look at what they need to do. So if you can, I would try to have somebody else do your own programming. This is something that not everybody struggles with. You tend to hear the guys that maybe they aren't necessarily the brightest guys, or they don't get the best grades. The guys that don't overthink, you often hear that these are the guys that succeed, maybe because they don't have the highest IQ. And there is some truth to the fact that overthinking can kill you when you're on the mound trying to compete, trying to have to repeat your mechanics and not be in overthinking, overanalyzing mode. So with the athletes we coach, I would say maybe 15–20% of them, they kind of fall in this very over-analytical category, where they're constantly overthinking everything. They're focusing on internal cues. Where's my hand? Did I push my elbow on that throw? Where did I land on my foot? They're focusing on all these different internal variables, and they can't put themselves outside of that analytical mode and into competing mode. Now, obviously in training, in certain scenarios, you do need to be analytical and be able to identify different feels and what's working and what's not, and good reps and bad reps, depending on what you're working on. But it definitely can be a double-edged sword, and it's something that me personally, as an analytical thrower, as an analytical pitcher, I've struggled with myself. So for me personally, solutions are definitely be aware of how much you're watching your own mechanics. For me, I spent maybe the first 3–4 years of my training, like all through high school, I was all about learning about mechanics, and I would throw 5 throws, go look at the mechanics, see what I did right, did wrong, try to make the adjustment the next 5 throws. That's really a good way to get in your head and not make any progress. So for me, I made the most progress when I got away from overanalyzing my video and focused a lot more on the feel side of things. So I knew what I was working on, but rather than take the studying video approach and just micro-analyzing it 20 times a day, I would take that exact same thing I was working on and try to feel my way through it, and then I can directly look at the result throw to throw. How did that ball come out of my hand? How did the ball spin? How did it feel? Was that lower effort? So going to college, not being able to have a radar gun, not being able to film myself day to day, not being able to spend 2 minutes in between throws, maybe overthinking what I need to do for that next throw. Just because you're with a partner and you're having to keep the flow of things. I made a lot of progress. I got from 85 to 95 over those 4 years without really a regular access to a radar gun or videoing myself at all. And I attribute a lot of that to getting outside of my head, not looking at my mechanics, and just being a pitcher, understanding the feel, and trying to replicate higher efficiency throws, but from more of an internal focus. It's still useful to have somebody who can look at your mechanics and then they can kind of translate what they're seeing. So that's what I'll do now. I have a couple trusted people who know my mechanics, who I go to for advice, and I'll have them watch video of me, but I don't really watch the video as much as I can. I don't watch my own video. So if they're saying, hey, your hips aren't getting open, or you're pulling open your glove side, whatever the case may be, I'm able to interpret that without going and actually watching the video and starting to get into my own head. And I know I'm not the only one out there like this. I'd say that's about 20% of guys who could probably stand to watch less video. When it comes to watching video, I would be especially aware of watching super slow motion video and really overanalyzing that. Obviously, if you're talking about subtle pitch design things or grips, you need slow motion video. But there's something about watching full speed video that gives you the rhythm, the tempo. Your brain can transcribe that to movement better. And this especially goes for watching like MLB throwers that you're trying to emulate. Your brain can interpret and transcribe a full speed clip of a thrower much better than if you're just watching them in super slow motion. I had some of this effect when I got to college, and I'd always been around really crappy throwers, low 70s guys in high school, mid 70s guys. I wasn't around high level throwers, so I get to college and all these guys throw low 90s. So just being around all these guys that are throwing with much more efficient patterns, just seeing these efficient patterns live, real time, seeing the rhythm, seeing the connection, seeing the kinetic chain to action, watching high-level throwers in full speed has significantly more value than watching it in super slow motion, in my opinion, when it comes to being able to actually transcribe that feel, that visually what's happening to your own movement. So I think there is some value to that. Just be really careful with watching your own mechanics too much. And then to touch on having a good mentality on the mound, I think it depends on the guy, right? Like a Corey Kluber is going to have a different mentality than a Max Scherzer, but it works for both of them. They both have something that they found that works. There has to be an aspect of not caring what the outcome of the next pitch is, but whether you're getting there with a hyper-aggressive mentality or hyper-focused mentality, that's kind of the difference, and that's where trial and error and experimentation comes into play. Really like the Alan Jaeger mental stuff, so I would look into what he's doing as far as breathing, as far as being able to refocus pitch to pitch, as far as being able to flush what happened in the previous play, previous pitch, whatever happened, previous outing, even if it's not baseball related, something off the field, being able to flush all that pitch to pitch, that's the commonality amongst the best throwers, the best pitchers in the world, and being able to fully focus and execute on the next pitch. So you're going to have to, within that framework, figure out if it's more of a hyper-aggressive mentality or hyper-focused mentality that works best for you. But good question. Slightly the wrong question. I think what you're asking is what is the optimal body fat percentage when it comes to performance for baseball players? I'm not going to get into like what is a healthy BMI and like what constitutes being obese or having an eating disorder. So it's not really about the healthiness. I don't think that's your question. I think you're asking what is the optimal body fat range for a baseball player, and the answer that I always give is you want to be as athletically lean as you possibly can be, where you can comfortably maintain that. Now, what does that mean? It basically means look at MLB players, look at the body fat range that you see in MLB players. They're not all 6% body fat, but very few of them are over 20% body fat. So there's an athletically lean body fat range under which you can move efficiently, but you're not eating so little that it's going to impact your recovery. So in other words, an athlete, maybe myself, like maybe I could sustain 7 or 8% body fat year round, but to do that, I would need to be eating in such a caloric deficit consistently that it would begin to have an impact on my strength, my power, my ability to recover. If I'm constantly eating 2,500 calories a day versus what I, consistently am at right now, low 3,000s, 3,500. If I'm consistently eating such a low caloric range just to maintain such a lean state, there's a point of diminishing returns there too. So you don't need to be super shredded, but at the same time, if you get too high of a body fat percentage, that can start to affect your ability to move efficiently. We've had a number of guys who came in over 20% body fat, maybe already through with decent numbers, had good strength numbers, and one of their main things was just improving their leanness and just getting them back to that athletically lean range. For us, it's about somewhere in the 10 to 20% range, usually in the 10 to 16% range. Another general rule of thumb is you should be able to see top abs. You don't need to have a six-pack, but you shouldn't have small beer belly either. So top abs is just a general good rule of thumb. Really not much advantage to being significantly over that or significantly shredded either. But within that, I think you're going to find that there's a optimal, even within that specific range, you're going to find over time what your optimal range is within that. So for me, maybe my range is 200 pounds at 10% body fat, or I can also be 220 at 16% body fat. And it kind of just depends. Like I can be either one of those in 3 months at any time if I want to be. But for me, I found that my best range is right around the middle, right around 210, right around 12% body fat. So I've experimented over time. What is a body fat where I feel the best, I recover the best, I can comfortably maintain it, where I'm not killing myself in the kitchen, and where I perform the best. So once you've built a strength base, once you are relatively advanced from a training standpoint, figuring out what is the body fat percentage that gives you the best performance, and that's going to be a little bit more of fine-tuning what you feel and perform the best. So good question there. We actually got a number of questions about hip rotation, about front leg bracing. I'm not going to go through all of those right now because we're actually planning a full in-depth video that breaks down all the different variables that go into front leg bracing and getting the hips open into landing, and the back knee rotating down, back hip rotating down into landing. This is a very, very common question that we got so much that we're going to dedicate that to a full video next week. So I'm going to gloss over those for now, and we're just going to talk about that more next week. This is a really good question. I love it. I think it depends on the context. It depends on the guy. So obviously we can't get into too many specifics right here. Just a point of clarification. Isometric training, we're not specifically trying to mimic and exactly replicate a part of the delivery as much as we're identifying joint angles that need to be used in the delivery, or particular weak joint angles or weak points in an athlete that we've identified through whatever assessment process. And we're just trying to reinforce that specific joint angle. So just so people are clear on that question, we're not specifically trying to replicate the skill of throwing in the weight room, but identifying those angles and then training them. So I'm a huge fan of it for the right scenario, the right athlete, in the right case. So yeah, I think that's more of a topic for a separate article, a separate video. We're going to get into that in a little more detail, but good question. When it comes to getting discovered, it's really, these days it's not as much about getting discovered as it is just about being good enough. So we talk all the time about how if you're throwing 100 miles an hour in the middle of nowhere, somebody's going to find you. All you need to do is post a clip of it online. Someone's going to find you. Someone's going to identify that talent and that ability. So again, it doesn't matter if you're D3, NAIA, D2, D1. If you're good enough, you are going to eventually get identified and have a shot. So you can think about any of the premier big leaguers right now. If you just took Rawls Chapman and suddenly he was just a nobody that no one had heard of, he was a 19-year-old kid and he just goes to any tryout anywhere, he posts one clip online throwing 101 miles an hour. You think it's going to be very long before he gets noticed, before he gets signed, before he works his way up to the exact same level he is right now? No, of course not. Because at a certain point, your talent speaks for itself. That being said, if you're at a level where thousands of other guys are at your current level, the question isn't really how to be discovered. It's not going to more perfect game events. It's not posting more clips of yourself throwing 86 online. It's figuring out how can I get myself to that point where I've separated myself from the rest of the pack. And so that is the question. That's everything that we're trying to accomplish as a company. That's everything we talk about all day. That's everything we talk about with our athletes one-on-one, assessing them, figuring out how can we get guys to the next level. So obviously can't answer that in one 1-minute answer, but that's everything that we're doing. And if you want to talk to us specifically about your specific situation, get an assessment, and get some more specifics on your goals, I'm happy to talk to you. So give us an email. So I'm not a dietitian. I'm not going to speak to the health or performance aspects of that. I will say that when it comes to diets, you want to make sure that you are getting a specific caloric requirement. You want to make sure you're getting specific macronutrient requirements. A concern that I would have with eliminating animal sources of protein is, one, the completeness of those protein sources. So that would be a main concern. Also, just anecdotally, a lot of the people that I know who have tried to switch away from animal-based protein sources tend to lose weight, strength, and even if they feel better from a mental standpoint, they tend to perform worse from a performance standpoint. That's purely anecdotal. I'm sure it's possible to figure out how to combine your protein sources, figure out how to still get a good amount of calories in. Most plant-based food sources tend to be very satiating. They tend to be very filling. And if you need a high amount of calories on a daily basis, it's going to be very, very tough to do that. You're going to make your life a lot harder. Force feeding 4,000 or 5,000 calories of plant-based food versus animal food tends to be a lot more calorically dense. At least a number of those, fattier meat sources, whole milk. A lot of the calorie-dense foods that we recommend are animal sources. So if you're a guy who needs to gain weight and who is trying to or maintain weight even in season on a high-calorie diet, I'm sure it's possible, but it's going to be a lot more details to figure out if you're eliminating a whole, a large food group, a large source of animal proteins. So I'd just be aware of that. I would do your research. I would look into that more. Renaissance Periodization has a lot of great diet information. I would check them out. So yeah, we can get into that a little bit more in a future video if a lot of people have that question, but I would just do your research and really make sure that you're hitting the macro goals and calorie goals that you need. I'm not a physical therapist. I'm not a chiro, so I'm not going to get into specifics because that's not what we do. However, I will say that when you find a therapist to assess you, have them take a look at your adductor chain. If you're having hip impingement, it's having to do with where the femoral head is in the acetabulum and the control of that. I would make sure that the adductors aren't overly tight, as they often are in rotational athletes. For me personally, I've had some pretty brutal hip pinching in certain ranges of motion, and the adductors are consistently a theme that doing steady tissue work on there seems to help. Having good control of your pelvis, good eccentric control as you go through different movements, single leg RDLs, hip airplanes, making sure you have good pelvic control and the glute can do its job to keep the femoral head stabilized. That can play a role as well. And then if you're really just not getting better, it becomes a chronic issue. Might be worth asking your therapist about getting some imaging to see if you have any sort of bony abnormalities that you're just not going to be able to work around, or that might end up requiring surgery. So definitely get assessed on that one, but check the adductors, check pelvic control, and check if there's any sort of bony abnormality. Medicine ball work, the main purpose of medicine ball work is power development. It's something that takes us from the strength end of the strength-speed continuum to more of the absolute speed end of the strength-speed continuum. In season, you're doing so much throwing. Throwing in and of itself is an absolute speed activity that if you're throwing 50, 70, 100 throws a day, even more every single day, adding in additional med ball work can be somewhat counterproductive, because it's just additional reps that you don't necessarily need. You're already getting all these reps in season, and you're constantly on the verge of not being able to recover game to game, day to day. So the volume of med ball work should be significantly lower. That being said, I still like a couple sets here and there pre-lift as kind of a central nervous system primer, a couple slams or pullover throws, prior to back work, a couple single arm shot puts or medicine ball chest passes prior to push-ups or anything like that in season. So it's still something you can keep in there, but it's not something that needs to be prioritized heavily just because you are getting a high volume of throwing in season. We've touched on this in previous Q&As to some extent, but the follow-through position is largely a result of what happens earlier in the kinetic chain. And what I mean there is that you can't just go throw to throw and suddenly say on one pitch, I'm going to finish better. And you end up doing the same exact thing to get to the same spot, and then you just try to reach more or get on top of the ball more. This is the classic coach on a bucket cue that you leave a pitch up and the coach says get on top of it more next pitch. And what they fail to understand is that what the arm slot and the result of the pitch is a product of what happens earlier in the kinetic chain. So maybe it's that you didn't stay on your backside long enough, and so you unloaded early, you got onto your front side, and then the arm wasn't on time. Maybe it's that you opened up the pelvis early, the shoulders opened up early, you spun off the pitch. But regardless, you don't need to focus on the end of the throw. The focus should be more on the proximal part of the body versus distal, and on the initial part of the throw versus the end of the throw. And by the end of the throw has already happened. So talking about finishing with a flatter back, one of the key concepts to having a good horizontal application of force is being able to get lateral into the back leg. If you can shift your weight properly and get lateral into the back leg, in other words, if you shift properly and then as you begin to drive, you can create a better angle of force application off the back leg, your application of force off the front leg is going to mirror that. So somebody with a very, very upright delivery, more of a tall and fall guy who doesn't shift well, that force application on the back leg might look something like this. The force application on the front leg is going to be very vertical as well. It's going to mirror that. Versus somebody who gets very, very lateral, and I'll post a couple of clips of guys over top of this in the editing. Somebody who gets very, very lateral, that front leg is going to mirror that angle. So the more lateral we can get on the weight shift, the more lateral we'll get on the back leg drive force vector, the more lateral we'll get on the front leg brace, and then what happens, it acts like a catapult. Now the torso into ball release will mirror that back leg angle. So the more lateral we can get, the more extension you'll end up ultimately getting over the front side, assuming of course front leg braces properly, everything sequences properly. So we can get into that more in a future video, but that's a good question. This is something that I had to learn myself the hard way, because obviously getting from a total beginner in the weight room and getting to kind of intermediate advanced level of strength, you're going to see pretty large increase in your ability to produce force, in your velocity in most cases. And again, there is a diminishing return. Once you get strong enough, there isn't necessarily a huge benefit to going from a 400-pound squat to a 500-pound squat, or going from a 100-pound dumbbell bench press to a 120-pound dumbbell bench press. So we built out a metric analysis tool, a free tool that you guys can download. It's just a spreadsheet. I'll link that in the video as well, so you guys can basically input all your numbers for all these various metrics, and it will tell you not only how you rank for your age, for your level, but also what those specific metrics are. I'll go through some of those real quick. So deadlift, we're looking for a low 400s to mid 400s deadlift for 3 to 5 clean reps, low 400s, 405-ish if it's a straight bar, and mid 400s if it's a trap bar. For squat, we're looking for about 315 to 335, somewhere in there, for 3 to 5 clean, full reps. And dumbbell bench press, looking for 100-pound dumbbells for 3 to 5 clean reps, full depth. And then same thing on dumbbell rows or any sort of rowing variation, about 100 pounds per arm for 3 to 5 clean reps. So those are some of the very, very basic numbers. I don't like doing it by body weight ratios, because then if you have a 135 pound kid who's just very, very strong for his size, but he's moving around 75-pound dumbbells, when it comes to the guys who throw 95 plus at the highest level, it tends to be more based on kind of these absolute strength numbers than as much about relative strength. It's more of an absolute number thing than relative. So I like keeping it about kind of those baselines that I mentioned, versus saying like 1.2 times your body weight in bench or double body weight deadlift. I'd rather keep it to the absolute numbers for that reason. So definitely check out the tool. It's free. Let me know what you think. This piggybacks off the last question well. So once you have built a strength base, you've increased your muscle mass, you've built up this ability to apply a high amount of force. The next step in that progression, versus continuing to just increase your force output more and more and more and keep spending years and years chasing a 600-pound deadlift or a 400-pound bench press, rather than do that, the focus should then shift when it comes to performance to the power end of the continuum. I've built up my ability to apply a large amount of force. Now can I maintain that and be able to apply that as quickly as possible? So when it comes to that, we shift the focus to Now there's a bare maintenance, there's a bare minimum of strength work to maintain what we've built. We don't completely cut that out of programming. There's just enough, maybe you build up to one top set on that movement just to maintain the strength. But then the focus of that session and the focus of those mesocycles, the focus of those phases of the off season become much more about increasing rate of force development, increasing power output. And so we're dealing, depending on the phase, we're dealing with anywhere from 30% to 60, 70% 1 rep max, somewhere in that range. That 50 to 60% range is a little bit more strength speed. That 30 to 50% range is a little bit more speed strength. And then we'll do some absolute speed at end of the continuum things as well. Lighter medicine ball work, sprint work for the lower body, body weight plyometrics. So it's a whole spectrum, but we're working within that range of the continuum once that strength threshold has been built. So good question. When it comes to sports performance and training for aesthetics, when it comes to novices, there's a large amount of overlap. And this goes for basically any goal, right? Like if your goal is to become a better cyclist or become a better powerlifter or become a better baseball player, if you're a complete novice and you just bike, your squat's gonna go up, your muscle mass in your lower body is gonna go up, your endurance is gonna go up, your proficiency as a cyclist is gonna go up. So if you're a novice at something, then it's very, very general. The adaptations are gonna have a lot of carryover. So training for aesthetics, if you're just trying to get leaner, you can get leaner in a lot of different ways, including training specifically for performance. So if you're 200 pounds, 20% body fat, you can still be training baseball specific movements. You can still be working on your mobility needs for baseball. You don't need to be on some crazy high volume hypertrophy program to get leaner and maintain your muscle mass or increase that while you're getting leaner. So again, as you, depending on the goal, there's a lot of overlap initially, and then as you get more advanced, those begin to branch out, and it needs to get more and more specialized as you get more advanced. That being said, training for aesthetics ultimately is going to be a different set of adaptations than training for baseball once you get to a high enough level. Case in point, let's say you're squatting 315 and you're training for baseball, and you're trying to balance the needs with throwing. So to build, let's say, quad size, like right for a hypertrophy goal, your goal is to just build maximum quad, hamstring, glute size. But your goal for baseball is its strength, its power, its force output. So for hypertrophy, you would do high volume training. You might do 5 sets of 8. You might do 5 sets of 10. You're doing decently heavy, but not super heavy. You're doing high volume, and you're basically just trashing your body. I mean, you're going crazy high volume. And if you do that for baseball, that's going to have a very negative carryover into your ability to repeat your mechanics, to have productive throwing sessions. It's not going to be using a high enough load to really increase absolute strength to the extent that you want. So they're just competing adaptations, and at a certain point, you're just going to have to pick which one is more important to you. And I'm assuming it's baseball if you're following us. So good question. You can definitely still continue to get leaner though as you train for baseball and get in that athletically lean range that we talked about earlier in this podcast. I'm actually going to link below, because we have addressed this question before. We have a full video on arm action theory, scap loading, arm flip up, pec stretch. What are all these things? Elbow flexion angle. What are all these things? How do they matter? How are they exhibited in various big league pitchers? And then we have a video on how to fix a pushing arm action, which is essentially what you're talking about. If you're not getting that arm to flip up back behind you, the elbow's creeping forward. We're essentially talking about fixing a pushing arm action. So we have an article on that as well, and how to fix that, different drills and different things that could be creating that. So I'm going to link to both of those, and we're going to just kind of gloss over the question for now. Alex, I don't know anything about you, but I'm going to put myself in my shoes when I was 15, 16 years old, and I thought that I could self-assess all of my issues, and I thought that I could just, if I read enough articles, I would just create my own programs, and I'd be great. It'd be the perfect program. I always thought that I could create the perfect program if I just read another article or bought this info product, and I'm a little conflicted about it, because on the one hand, that's how I learned, and eventually I learned through that process of trial and error and trying my own things and writing things and testing them and seeing what worked and what didn't. But at the same time, in baseball, you have a very specific time window in which to improve, in which to get recruited, in which to get scouted, in which to develop. So for me, looking back, I'm conflicted because on the one hand, I learned a lot by trying to write everything myself, trying to do all these assessments myself, but I really was limited to what I could find online and the people that I could find to talk to because of that. So looking back, I really wish I had found some sort of mentor, coach, somebody that I'd actually trusted. Obviously, you can't just trust your career to anybody, but somebody that I had trusted who could perform a mobility assessment, who could shave off so much time from that trial and error process that I had to learn myself. So I really would encourage you to find somebody like that. And that's not a self-promotion. That can be, there's a number of people in the industry that I would trust. Besides us, I really would find somebody who can shorten that trial and error process. That's all coaching is. Coaching is a trial and error process. There isn't a single coach out there that just knows every single thing there is to know. Every specific case has the magic answer for everything, but they do have a wide range of experience. They've worked with hundreds, maybe thousands of athletes, depending on the coach. And so they've seen a lot of different things and what works and what doesn't, and you begin to hone in on at least what to avoid and give you a better chance of not wandering into a ditch in your own training. So maybe not for you, but for other guys watching who have a similar question, I really would try to outsource that as much as you can and learn from people who have been around it as much as possible before trying to just assess yourself if you can. So this comes into, you're going to have to do a little bit of investigating and try to problem solve and figure out what variables changed. Sometimes it could be a sign of an oncoming injury. I have had this in the past where I had a dead arm phase and I couldn't figure out, there was nothing really different about my mechanics that I could tell at the time. There ended up being something different, but I couldn't figure that out at the time. I didn't have any pain. Velo was down 6-7 miles an hour. And then all of a sudden the pain came, ended up being a labrum issue, and I had unintentionally raised my arm slot and I was getting some grinding. So it could be an indicator that there's some inhibition happening and you're on the verge of doing some damage. I would say, however, in most cases, unless you're feeling this weird arm, like dead arm sensation, there's usually some sort of mechanical culprit or fatigue culprit at play. Mechanical culprit, again, we can't get into all of those there, but maybe you tried a new cue or your coach gave you a new drill or whatever the case may be, you've done something different now than when you did in the past. Or maybe you were in peak condition end of the summer, you took 3 months off and you got back to throwing and you just couldn't find it again. And it just doesn't feel like the same efficiency again. And so you just can't pinpoint it, but there's some sort of mechanical factor that just isn't there that had clicked at the end of the summer. So usually it's a mechanical factor if it's just out of the blue. Sometimes it's fatigue related. So in the fall especially, guys are training hard, they're getting after it in the weight room. This goes for most college guys for sure. You're having to do conditioning multiple times a week. Maybe you're running every day, you're lifting 4 times a week. So definitely fatigue can play a role. It's pretty common that whatever your velocity is in the fall, in inner squads, whatever, you should be a couple higher in the spring when you're in more of a maintenance type of training scenario. So again, a lot of variables. I could write an article with 40 things it could be. But if you have further questions besides that, just email us, reach out, and we'll try to touch more on your specific situation. There's so many variables that go into an athlete's genetic limit that it's really hard to say. Again, it depends on the specific guy. Somebody who's 5'1" that's moving perfectly, but they're throwing 81. I'm not going to guarantee that he could throw 90, but someone who's 6'6" has the worst mechanics you've ever seen, poor mobility, and he's throwing 87. Like, yeah, that guy's probably going to be able to throw over 90. So there's extreme scenarios like this. I think most guys are capable of throwing significantly harder than anybody gives them credit for, and certainly anybody who's already throwing into the mid-80s who has not been training for 10 years, it's very, very likely they're capable of touching 90 if they're already in the mid-80s and they have not been hunting down every single avenue for the past 10 years trying to get better. That's very unlikely they're close to their genetic limit. So again, it depends. I could write an article with 100 things that could contribute to your genetic limit. But again, we'll talk more about your specific case. Happy to get on a call with you. Honestly, to stand out to scouts, you need to show pro stuff. You need to show results, and you need to show raw stuff that would play at the next level. So then you need to ask yourself, okay, sidearmers at the next level, what is their stuff? By and large, really the lowest end of that range, the slowest throwing sidearmers that you see, if we're not talking about submariners, we're talking about sidearmers, you're going to see low to mid 80s. And you're going to see nasty sink, cut, run, something to that effect. You're going to see the ability to move the ball around, generate ground balls. That's really the lowest end of the range. You're going to see all the way up to mid 90s sidearm guys. So being good enough, really having good stuff that projects at the next level, that's how you get noticed, that's how you stand out to scouts. And then one extra recommendation you might think about, we have done this before, is recommend that certain sidearm guys still work on having a show pitch from a higher arm slot. One of the nastiest pitchers I played with in college, he didn't end up getting drafted, which shows you how tough it is to get drafted as a sidearm submarine guy who doesn't have velo. He was a 80-84 lefty who his ball dropped 1.5 feet every time, generated ground balls, but he would come over the top with an 88 to 90 mile an hour. He had a fastball cutter combo over the top, and it would be his kind of strikeout pitch or his 0-2 pitch. He would just bring it out of nowhere. If you can still go through some long toss velocity work and have that extra arm slot, it suddenly puts you in your own category of pitcher, and you're no longer competing against all these other sidearmers who are throwing, let's say, 84, but it makes you the 84 mile an hour sidearmer who can also throw 89 over the top. And you now create your own category, and you aren't being compared against those guys, and you become something unique. So you pair that with the ability to actually continue getting results and getting batters out, especially in a good conference against good hitters. Now you stand out more to scouts than a one-dimensional pitcher who is maybe just an 83 mile an hour submarine sidearm guy with some sink. So getting the velocity up as much as possible. I have some articles and content on that for submarine and sidearm guys, being a low slot guy myself. But also for true sidearm or submarine guys, having that dual threat arm slot can really separate yourself. Even if it's just a show pitch for scouts or an 0-2 pitch, it can separate you. I will say there's some truth to higher intensity throwing lending itself to the body figuring out more efficient patterns. So there is a little bit of truth to that, but at the same time, you can't just give kids a baseball or plyo care balls or weighted balls and just have them go do pull downs and throw the crap out of it and assume that they're going to find perfect patterns, perfect positions. It needs to be a guided process where they need to earn the right to throw max intensity. They need to earn the right to go do pull downs. They need to demonstrate that they have good stability, good core control. They have a decent strength base. They can do 5 push-ups. They can do 5 or 10 inverted rows. They can do a bodyweight lunge without wobbling back and forth before you go and just have them start ripping balls as hard as they can. Specifically, I would work on making sure they understand how to dissociate their hips from their shoulders and how to get their arm up and on time. If they can do those 2 things, they're ahead of a lot of younger kids. And then I would try to reinforce that once you have the mechanical guardrails in place. Like, they're doing a decent job of just separating, getting the arm on time, relaxing the arm into layback, rotating through release. And once you have the guardrails in place and the mechanics look decent, I would really start to reinforce that with athletic drills that don't force them to overanalyze too much. So jump back drills, quarterback drills, anything that adds a dynamic component, especially when they don't have to overthink. Toss them a ball, have them do a shuffle step and throw. Different athletic drills that force them to become athletic, become an athlete. Firmly believe this is why the shortstops tend to become really good pitchers when they convert later in their careers, because they're constantly having to be athletic, having to field ground balls, and do this from all these different angles. And so their body just learns, and they become athletic, and they become efficient. And it doesn't just work if at certain times, certain guys just figure it out. But if you have a major timing issue with a certain kid, you are going to have to break that down and drill that and figure out how to specifically address that. But again, once you have the guardrails in place, reinforcing that with just athletic drills and letting their body figure it out and take it from there. If you're working on a completely new lower body or any change for that example, it helps as much as you can to keep the initial focus on as slow as you can still repeat the movement. In other words, for certain drills, if you try to go through the movement at 10% speed, you can't create enough fluidity and connection in the movement to get anything out of it. Like if I'm trying to go through an arm action drill at 10%, you can't actually create enough rotational force to get any layback at all to where you can really feel like you're replicating the movement. But maybe the minimum effort you can go to feel like you're getting anything out of the movement is 30%. So go 30% intensity, 30% speed. So it depends on the movement, depends on the drill, depends on the specific part of your mechanics that you're working on. But yes, in general, you should make sure that you have the basics down before you just go balls to the wall and say intent's going to fix everything. The second you just go blind intent, you literally switch your brain to a different part of your brain, and it just becomes this animalistic part of your brain that's just, it's going to take whatever the default pattern you already have is. It's going to take the default pattern that you're strongest in and most comfortable with, and it's going to recruit those muscle fibers, and it's going to get to the end goal, which is throw the crap out of the ball. And that's not always desirable when you're trying to take a step back from that and repattern something that's been a consistent progress, a consistent problem for you, I'm guessing, for months or even years. So, in javelin, they do this religiously. They're not throwing max effort very often because of how stressful it is. So they do so much slower work, patterning work, tempo work, just to work on the technique and the sequencing and the relationship of all the different body parts and the rhythm of everything. So I think it's a big mistake for a lot of people. They think that they need to throw max effort 2, 3, 4, 5 times a week to get anything out of their throwing program, when the bottom line is we've been getting amazing results with our guys, and they're testing max effort twice a week at most after they built up to that. And even then it's 15, 20, 25 max effort throws at most. So you don't need a high volume of high intensity throws to create results. A lot of the results that you're creating are from improving the patterning, the sequencing, the muscle recruitment, getting into better positions. So you can do that, and you should do that, especially when learning a completely new skill or completely new pattern for your delivery. So good question. So I'm assuming this is a pretty young kid, because if he's 14, 15, if he's in high school, then he really should be getting a gym membership for his training, if that's something that matters to him. But if it's a young kid, some of the things that you can do would definitely do push-up variations. If you can't do good, clean bodyweight push-ups, have them start on the staircase, have them start on the couch, something elevated, but where you're cueing good, proper form. Really, really common. You see kids, they just immediately try to do floor push-ups, and they're doing the terrible form push-ups, elbows flaring, butt up in the air, and they're not getting much out of it. So I'd rather somebody do 3 good, clean push-ups with good form than a set of 15 with bad form, because ultimately what it comes down to with young kids is you are reinforcing certain movement patterns. You're reinforcing movement with lifting. It's not just about getting bigger, stronger muscles. You're going to get that with any sort of progressive overload, any sort of consistent exercise. You're going to get bigger, you're going to get stronger, but what are you reinforcing? And training, the whole point of training is to take specific movement patterns and load those patterns. So the point of pressing, any sort of pressing variation, is to take a good, clean pressing pattern, full range of motion, scapula in a good position, humerus in a good position, and load that, get stronger in that pattern, in that position. Same thing with rowing, same thing with squatting variations, hip hinging or deadlift variations. It's to get better at the movement and gain strength and load the movement itself. Because you're going to get the hypertrophy, the muscle mass, the strength. You're going to get all these things just by loading it week after week after week. So just really making sure for young kids they're doing it right the first time. Push-ups, inverted rows are great. You can get a doorway pull-up bar. You can start working on pull-ups indoors. You can hang a TRX strap or blast straps, whatever, from the pull-up bar, do inverted rows. You can get a band and do band pull-aparts. You can do different lunge variations. You can get light dumbbells and do goblet squat reverse lunges, goblet squats to a step. So you can do a lot of different things inside with kids, and it doesn't have to be complicated. If you get 5 or 6 core movements down, even just the ones I mentioned, you have your main pull, which is inverted rows and pull-ups. Main push, you have your push-ups. You have a main squatting movement, goblet squats to a box, cue, good form, good depth. And you have a goblet reverse lunge. There's your single leg lunging variation. You could maybe do a goblet reverse lunge to get a lateral movement as well. And then you have some sort of scapular work as well, band pull-aparts, and in different planes. You've got a pretty good program based on just a few exercises that you can do anywhere. So if you want more specifics, definitely email us, reach out, and we'll go from there. But there's a lot of options that don't require a gym when it comes to very, very beginner exercises and for kids. So great question from Clown of all things clownery. And with that being said, we will wrap up episode 4. I hope you guys have gotten a lot out of this. If we didn't get to your question and you're furious before you type up an angry comment, shoot us an email and we'll explain why we didn't get to it, or try to get to it in the next episode. But that being said, this has been Brewster, Triathletics. We're very excited about what we're doing here as a company. We are a 100% remote training company. We just got our new headquarters, so we are going to be opening this up over the next year or so to in-person visits and in-person assessments for our remote athletes. So stay tuned, follow us on social media if you don't already. We'll be announcing when this facility is opening up for visits and how that's going to work. But again, very, very excited about what we're doing here. Big 2020 coming up. So thanks for watching, and we'll be in touch.